Welcome to Global Ethics Review. I'm Alex Woodson from Carnegie Council, the world's catalyst for ethical action. In this podcast series, we'll be connecting Carnegie Council's work and current events with our senior fellows, senior staff, and friends of our organization. You'll hear from leading experts on artificial intelligence and technology, migration, climate change governance, and U.S. foreign policy and global engagement. This week, I'm speaking with Professor Michael Doyle. He is a university professor at Columbia affiliated with the School of International and Public Affairs, the Department of Political Science, and the Law School. Professor Doyle is also a senior fellow at Carnegie Council for the Model International Mobility Convention, or MIMC. In this podcast, we discuss this initiative, which is focused on creating a better set of rules for the movement of people across borders. We also touched on the Biden administration and the situation at the U.S. Mexico border and how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected migration across the world. For more on MIMC, you can go to carnegiecouncil.org or internationalmobilityconvention.org. But for now, here's my talk with Professor Michael Doyle. Professor Michael Doyle, great to speak with you. So just to get started, what is the Model International Mobility Convention and how did it come about?
The convention is what we call the realistic utopia. That is, it was designed to create a better set of rules for the movement of people across borders. And at the same time, it was designed to be realistic enough that we could imagine, governments of the world as the world is today, that is sovereign states, if they were better inspired, had a longer run view on the future, signing this convention. So it's not utopian, it's a realistic utopia. That was what we had in mind. 30 plus experts got together from 2015 to 2017 and developed this model convention, a set of rules that's both comprehensive and cumulative. Comprehensive is that unlike other attempts to think about the movement of people across borders, it covers all the different statuses from a temporary visitor through a tourist, through a foreign student, a labor migrant, an investor, family reunification, and then the forced migrants. So it covers all of these different reasons for which people might be moving across borders. And second of all, it's cumulative. The basic insight is that if you're a visitor, you only need to be able to realize a few of your rights. If you get run over by a car, you need emergency medical attention. If you run someone else over in a car you rented, you need fair access to the courts, and you need your basic freedoms of expression, religion, etc. But you don't necessarily have a right to a job in most countries, and nor will you likely have a right to vote. And as you move across the statuses we described, from tourist, you need to have your contracts honored. Foreign students need to have access to a university and a transcript when they're done. Labor migrants need, equal pay for equal work, etc. All the way up to a refugee, and a refugee needs all of their rights, all of their human rights that have been denied by the home country, and they need those rights in the country of asylum. So, comprehensive and cumulative are the two big insights that we came up with.
So we talked about this in 2019. I wonder, a lot of things in the world have changed since then. I imagine some aspects of MIMC, Model International Mobility Convention, as we'll be calling it, I imagine some aspects of that have changed as well. So how has this developed and evolved in the last couple of years?
Well, in the world, good news and bad news. The good news, and I hate to be so political, but the President Trump administration was deeply hostile to any notion of an equitable, stable, orderly regime for international migration. Migrants were treated like threats, no matter what. That is, there was a negative stereotyping of just about all forms of migrants, with one exception. Norwegians were very nice people, but nonetheless, they were the only ones who escaped these denunciations. So we no longer have the Trump administration with us. I know that sounds political, but from the standpoint of migration and refugees, it was a record of abuse. So we have a much more sensible regime, in my opinion, with Mr. Biden. And that's some good news. The bad news is that the crises that affect and drive refugees across borders have not been resolved. Indeed, more have been added to them since 2018 and 2019. A major crisis in Ethiopia, in the Tigray province, have driven tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands across borders. We don't yet have an adequate count, and we don't know where they've all gone. The refugee crisis that brought the Rohingya to Bangladesh, no resolution of that. The crises that brought the Venezuelans in large numbers into Colombia, no resolution of that. The hurricanes in Central America that affected deeply Honduras, Nicaragua, Guatemala, the hurricanes of 2020 have contributed to drive people north looking for a new livelihood, escaping from those horrendous conditions. So that's the bad part. And so we haven't seen much. And that's, it's a mixed picture. No major big steps forward, continuing refugee crises. But now with the change in the United States, we have an administration that is at least in their hearts prepared to do something more. So it's a mixed picture in the world. You also asked a second question, which I'd be happy to address. What have we been doing to respond to that? And we've been doing three things. The first thing we've done, which is that we've joined the Carnegie Council, which is something we're immensely grateful for. As a home, it's exactly the right home. This is an institution, I don't need to tell you, committed to doing good in the world with one foot, really very much on the ground. It's designed to do practical good. And so I think we fit very well into that Carnegie identity. So we're delighted to be associated with it in the way that we are. So that's some good news. Another piece of development, which is very important, is that the Model International Mobility Convention was drafted by 30 plus experts, but overwhelmingly they were from North America and Europe. And we had voices coming from elsewhere in the world, but in my opinion, not quite enough. And one of the things we've created on arriving at Carnegie is this network, a leadership network, to help further develop the convention as it needs to adjust. And second of all, help promote it. And this includes, charter members from South Africa, South Korea, London again, Brazil in South America, from Rio de Janeiro, a former mayor from Ecuador. All of this group has helped to an eminent human rights lawyer from Bangladesh. This group is now providing the leadership of MIMC. And so it has a genuine global footprint in ways that we all think are important. Lastly, we've done some developmental work, that is rethinking, developing some of the ideas, including ones that are highly practical that can be used today. MIMC is a long-run reform agenda designed for the next 20 years, but within it are a series of ideas that can be used today. And the mobility visa proposal is one of them. And we're also working on what responsibility sharing might look like in practice. And we just finished a paper, that is Mark Woods and Janine Prantle and myself, a paper that outlines what responsibility sharing could look like. And we're writing it for a law review. So those are some of the things we've been doing.
Definitely, and I think in the coming months, we'll be speaking about some of those developments, podcasts and other forums as well. I just want to go back to the question about how migration has changed over the past couple of years. The biggest story from the last year has been the COVID-19 pandemic, obviously. And I imagine, well, I'll just let you let you say it. Did that change your thinking on migration at all? Did that change the work of MIMC, or did it just reaffirm that you need to do this work and maybe do it on a quicker timescale?
At the principle level of a more orderly and humane network for the movement of people across borders, those principles are simply reaffirmed by the global crisis. We need to approach this in a solidaristic, cooperative way if we're ever going to address COVID. So we feel like we're still connected to where the future is going, if not more so. But frankly, there's a lot of things that were surprising for us. We have a standard of refuge, that is a standard of what constitutes a refugee or an asylum seeker who should get asylum, that focused on an external threat to your life. So we broadened the conventional notion of a refugee, somebody being persecuted by a state, for example, for race, religion, nationality, to anyone who is fleeing to save their life from an external threat. And that raises the big question that came up with COVID, that we hadn't thought about, back in 2015 and 2016. What about a pandemic disease? How should a mobility convention respond to a pandemic disease? And it was a big question. It's clearly a pandemic is partly external. That is, you're catching an external virus, but it's the internal effects on you that are making you vulnerable. In some cases, you may have to leave the area in which you live because it can't respond to the pandemic. On the other hand, there's nothing worse than people spreading the disease by moving around without any constraints. So in other words, a number of our assumptions were exploded by the impact of this disease, which means this leadership network I just described to you is going to take this on as an issue in the coming year, hold a workshop and say, what do we need to do to think about a better set of rules for when people can move and when they shouldn't move in the context of a pandemic. Just today as we speak, President Biden imposed a travel ban on 80% of the world's countries. That's pretty new and striking. And he's not necessarily wrong. That may be the best way to respond. On the other hand, would it be better to allow people to travel but just quarantine them, or require evidence of vaccines and allow them to travel? And we're just totally up in the air on these questions. None of us really predicted the pandemic. And so we need to do some heavy duty thinking in the months and years ahead to think about, what are the right rules on the movement of people across borders in light of the fact that this is likely to be not our last pandemic. We're likely to have something like this happening again.
So I want to speak about the Biden administration. In the first exchange, you said that you seem to have a much more positive view of the Biden administration than the Trump administration in terms of how they're handling migration. So I don't really want to get into the specifics of the whole refugee numbers and all that, just because we're recording this on April 20th, could be out in a few days, and the situation seems to be changing by the minute, by the hour in some ways. So just broadly speaking, what makes you optimistic about the Biden administration in terms of migration, and just in terms of, again, not speaking specifically about the refugee number, 15,000, 62,000, whatever it may be, just what are your impressions of how he's thinking about this issue in relation to MIMC and the work that you've been doing?
Yeah, I would say I'm guardedly optimistic. That is, to put it too simply, many of them that I've spoken with who are in the administration have really good hearts, but an unclear head when it comes to this issue. What do I mean by that? President Biden spoke about raising the refugee resettlement numbers back to, if not above, the level that were promised by President Obama back in 2016. And I think that's the right thing to do. The U.S. can easily resettle 125,000 refugees through resettlement each year. That's a good thing. They strongly condemned the way in which the Trump administration handled the issue of families crossing the border, the incarceration, so to speak, of children and separation of children from parents. All of that they saw as a humanitarian travesty is not maybe too strong a word, but that's where they're going. So the hearts were just right. The immigration bill that's being introduced in Congress, the 2020 immigration bill, has a number of very good features attached to it, including, for example, opening up a pathway for undocumented immigrants to someday, through a lengthy procedure, become both documented and indeed naturalized at some point. And all these things strike me as the right thing to do. But as you alluded to in your question, over the past month, we've seen the refugee resettlement numbers jump all around. At first, there was an announcement, no, we're going to keep the Trump numbers, which were about 15,000, way below what we should be doing as a country. And then a few days later, after there was a storm of protest, we have all new numbers. And as you say, we'll hear in a few days what those numbers are, On the border, they rightly said that we will provide refuge for unaccompanied children and protect them, and we won't separate children from parents. All that was a good thing, the right thing to do. But they didn't plan for the very likely effects, which is that people have been waiting for the past couple of years to try to get into the US, either genuine asylum seekers or ordinary migrants trying to get in one form or another, would take this as a signal it's time to move north in large numbers. And I saw numbers that indicate that, the flow across the border is one of the largest it's been in many, many years. And was that the plan? And if so, why so little preparation? Is this the right way to handle it? Should all the processing take place in the US? Or would it be better to have continued some of the Trump policy of doing processing in Mexico, but do it in a more humane and well-financed and protective kind of way? All of this stuff seems to be invented on the fly in ways that are very confusing. He's stopped building of the wall, that is, stopped using Defense Department funds, in my opinion, illegally taken from the Defense Department budget and applied to wall construction, which I think was the right thing to do. On the other hand, other funds applied to the wall continue to be spent, and there are still court cases in Texas and elsewhere where the administration is claiming eminent domain over property whose purpose is to build a wall. So again, the wall is stopped, but it hasn't really stopped. And what do you do with what's left over? You take it down? Who knows what? And again, there's I don't think they could have come in with a totally worked out policy, given the COVID crisis, given the chaos associated with Mr. Trump's attempt to overturn the election, all of which we've got to put, I think, in our minds when we think about how they're doing. But it has been a little bit chaotic as a rollout of a immigration asylum policy over the past month or two.
So I just want to stay on that subject and speak a little more specifically about MIMC. So if we take the example of an unaccompanied minor coming from Central America, as you mentioned, they've been devastated by hurricanes and lots of other issues. They make their way up through Mexico, get to the southern border. Mm-hmm. If we're living in a world where MIMC has been accepted by the United States, accepted by Mexico, accepted by lots of countries in the world, what changes exactly? What changes for this unaccompanied minor who doesn't know anyone in the United States, doesn't have his parents? What does that look like in this new world?
This is not something that we have got a lot of focus on in the treaty, except that the principles of humanity and human rights and the protection for people who are vulnerable are deeply embedded in it. And the first thing you would do is find the child's parents, and return the child to the parent if that's feasible. Because children on their own are extremely vulnerable. And so they would need all the protections that the American HHS, that is, or the Red Cross or whoever could make sure and provide. But the first thing would be to return them to their parents, to find out where their parents are, wherever they are. And if for some reason their parents are in the US, they should, needless to say, be handed over to their parents here. If their parents are in some other country, the child should be, to the extent you can, safely returned to them. So that's the first instance. If the family then is applying for immigration to the US, they should go through a set process. And MIMC envisaged that countries would identify their labor needs in a much more systematic way and make the visas that would fill those labor needs, that is, labor needs that could not be filled by citizens or already residents of the US, open for application to anyone from anywhere who met security and other conditions for applying for an immigrant visa, so that they would have a much better chance of actually having a visa, that is a legal permit to entry, before they set off on their journey toward the border. And so we would be filling the very large US demand for foreign labor through legal pathways much more intensively. The second thing is that it envisaged radical reforms in temporary visas for certain jobs that the country wants to open for temporary workers. And there would be more of them to fill those needs. And what would be different is that individuals would have better protections on these MIMC-based temporary visas than currently exist. They would have, for example, multiple visas so that when they could go back and forth to their home in a foreign country, if that was relevant. They would have portable pensions, so pension rights they earned during their temporary labor would be available, et cetera. And for refugees and asylum seekers, that is, people fleeing from persecution or to save their lives, there would be a well-established system that would assess their claim rapidly at the border or by UNHCR in assessment areas to determine whether or not they had a claim as a refugee or a genuine asylum seeker. And if they did, they would be taken in and provided with assistance for temporary or long-term integration. So in this world, we'd have a much more regular, humane, well-established system for both migration, both permanent and temporary labor migration, and for processing refugees. That would be the system. And that's the ideal that would be embedded in the convention. Now, there's always a distance between an ideal set of rules or laws and implementation. So however good the treaty might be, if it were someday signed, it still has to be implemented well, and we will need to make sure it is. But at least the rules will be more reasonable and humane.
This ties in with your article for the Ethics and International Affairs website, I believe. Yeah, you wrote that with Ellie Peltz, so finding refuge through employment worker visas as a complementary pathway for refugee resettlement. I'll link to that in the transcript. I encourage everyone to read that. And yeah, it just sounds like a much more orderly process. We're speaking broadly today about migration. You mentioned a few other issues that you're thinking about in your first answer. Maybe you could expand on those, or what are some other migration issues? In the United States, we're very focused on the southern border and the COVID-19 pandemic. But as you look across the world, what are some other issues that you think will maybe inform your work in the coming months?
Yeah, one of the things that we have to get much more serious about, both in the US and around the world, is the question of responsibility sharing. 86% of the world's refugees are being taken care of by developing countries. usually by the immediate neighbors of some civil war. So, most Syrians today who've had to flee the country are not in Europe or the United States or anywhere else. They're in Lebanon, they're in Jordan, they're in Turkey, Syria's immediate neighbors. The people who have had to flee from Burma, from Myanmar, they're in Bangladesh, the next door neighbor. The people who had to flee from Venezuela are overwhelmingly in Colombia, for example. A few have gone a bit further afield. And that's neither fair nor sustainable. They can't cover all of those costs and at the same time take care of their own people. These are developing countries, not the richer countries in the world. So we need a better way to share the global responsibility for people who've had to flee their own countries to save their lives. And we need to figure out some way to do that. One way would be to hold the countries, the governments that have forced those people to flee to be culpable. And, someone like Assad, the dictator of Syria, who is directly responsible in war crimes and crimes against humanity for driving out, the millions plus who've had to flee Syria, he should be forced to pay. Now, that's not easy. He's not going to volunteer to pay. But fortuitously, he and his family have assets in foreign banks that are probably, if you add them all up, over $2 billion US dollars. They're in banks in Germany, France, Canada, probably also in the US, Switzerland, and elsewhere. And measures should be taken to seize those assets and use them to support Syrian refugees in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, so that their financial costs could be borne with that money. And that would go a considerable way to helping provide support for them. And that would be a completely just use of those monies from the Assad family. So one way is culpability that improve responsibility sharing. The other is capability. That is, those countries of the world that are more capable of assisting should be upfront in doing so. Countries with big GDPs, large populations, make it easier to assimilate, integrate refugees, should be upfront. Those for whom it's more difficult because they have high unemployment or they've already taken in a whole bunch of refugees, should be asked for less. So we've developed a way to calculate those responsibility shares in a paper we've written. And I think we should urge that governments step up to the plate and meet some reasonable definition of what their responsibility shares should be. And the Europeans are trying to do this. They tried back in 2015 with a formula that didn't quite work. They tried it top down. They said, okay, Poland, you take this many, Czech Republic, this many, Hungary, this many. And those countries by and large said no. And so the distribution of refugees didn't work in that way. Only 15,000 totally out of the million that came to Europe in those years were settled. They've now developed a better scheme, which is that they're going to attach a 10,000 euro voucher. It's about 13,000 or so US bucks to every successful asylum seeker crossing the Mediterranean into Europe. And that voucher would be there to help integrate them into the economies that they're going into. And that's a better design because that's all paid for collectively by the EU budget, but it'll be spent by that asylum seeker, that refugee, in the countries in which they settle. And so the cost, financial cost, is shared across the EU. The spending will take place in a single country and help ease the cost of integrating, assimilating that refugee, that asylum seeker in the country in which they're seeking asylum. That's a better scheme. I'm not sure that it'll work, but it's been introduced in the European Parliament. And it would be a good outcome, in my opinion, a good way to handle integration. We in the U.S. could certainly step up, as I mentioned, and go back to Obama-level resettlements. And we should pay more of our fair share at the global level. But not just us, so should China, so should India, so should Japan, so should Russia, and many other countries step up and pay more of their fair share in supporting for the world's refugees.
Definitely, and I know MIMC is working on this and how
we are
in the future. So,
in a little bit, we could share with you some numbers that we've developed, but we have more work to do.
Definitely, yeah, we'll be following this. So, last question. We're talking about a lot of big issues, talking about millions of people, some very, very hard issues, very tough issues for a lot of people to think about. But if just an individual person is listening to this podcast and they want to help, they want to do something to help migrants, what would you suggest that they do? We've talked a lot about the governments and what they can do, but what can an individual person do right now in your mind?
Yeah, they can do one thing which is very easy, which is to go to the Carnegie website on the MIMC page and sign the convention. It's open for signature for anybody and everybody who wants to support these kinds of initiatives. And you'll find a summary of the convention there and a short version of it. And if this person finds this an attractive framework to think about for a better set of rules for moving people across borders, sign up. And you'll be, whoever might choose to do so, in very good company. Everyone from the former president of Mexico, Ernesto Zedillo, a great global statesman, through a whole group of international experts in refugee law and the sociology of migration, to students from around the world have already signed. So, please join them. Beyond that, if that person is associated with an NGO, they could encourage their NGO to join in with the MIMC. In a city, they could encourage the mayor's office to express support. The mayors are among the most progressive voices around the world when it comes to a better set of rules for migrants and refugees. Mayors have their feet firmly on the ground. What they care most about is that the citizens of their cities, send their kids to school and get vaccinated and pay their taxes and do all the things that good residents do. And so mayors are often at the forefront. It's also the place where most migrants and refugees wind up. If you're a member of a church or a temple, a synagogue, they have been at the forefront historically, especially in the US, of providing assistance to asylum seekers and refugees. And I hope that tradition continues. And if you're in a private corporation, we'll soon be reaching out to the private sector, asking the private sector to express support for these kind of principles and rules, and urge your own company to join in as well. All of those things would be valuable steps forward. Start out by signing it yourself and go to our website.
Professor Michael Doyle, thank you very much. It's great to have MIMC as part of Carnegie Council, and I'm sure we'll be talking again in the future.
I look forward to it. We're delighted to be part of the Carnegie family. Thank you. Thanks, Alex.
That was Michael Doyle, University Professor at Columbia University. For more on MIMC, you can go to internationalmobilityconvention.org or carnegiecouncil.org. Thanks for listening, and stay safe and healthy.